July 4, 1943. Midnight. Along a 250-mile stretch of the Russian steppe, 2 million men sat in the dark and waited. Some prayed. Some smoked their last cigarettes. Some stared at the sky and thought about their families. German tank commanders ran their hands over cold steel and checked their ammunition one final time. Soviet soldiers crouched in trenches so deep and so carefully dug that the earth itself had become a weapon. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone knew that by this time tomorrow, hundreds of thousands of them would be dead. What happened in the next 3 weeks would become the largest tank battle in human history. It would involve more than 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft. It would be fought across a landscape of extraordinary violence, in conditions that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. And when it was over, it would have decided the entire Second World War, though almost nobody realized it at the time. This is the story of the Battle of Kursk. The wound in the earth. To understand why Kursk happened, you have to understand what a salient is, and why generals both love and fear them. A salient is a bulge in the front line, a place where one army has pushed forward into enemy territory, creating a protrusion that juts out like a thumb pressing into a palm. The Kursk salient was enormous, roughly 150 miles wide and 100 miles deep, and it had formed in the aftermath of the brutal winter fighting of 1942 and early 1943, when Soviet forces had clawed back enormous swaths of Russian territory from the Germans. For the Wehrmacht, this bulge presented both a temptation and a problem. On the one hand, it was a vulnerability, a pocket of Soviet territory surrounded on 3 sides by German-held land, theoretically ripe for encirclement. On the other hand, the Soviets had filled that pocket with an enormous concentration of troops, artillery, and armor. To attack it was to hurl yourself into a carefully prepared killing ground. Adolf Hitler and his generals spent the spring of 1943 arguing about exactly this dilemma. Operation Citadel, the plan to pinch off the Kursk salient with simultaneous attacks from the north and south, had been on the table since April. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the brilliant German strategist who had masterminded the stunning encirclement at Stalingrad's relief attempt, pushed for an early offensive. Every week of delay, he argued, gave the Soviets more time to dig in. General Walter Model, commanding the northern pincer, disagreed. He needed more time, more tanks, more men. And Hitler, ever the gambler, ever the believer in the decisive blow that would change everything, kept postponing, waiting for the new Tiger and Panther tanks to arrive in sufficient numbers. That decision to wait would prove catastrophic. Because while the Germans debated, the Soviets were not idle. They were building the most elaborate defensive system in the history of warfare. The Soviet fortress. Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov had his own sources of intelligence, and they were telling him something extraordinary. The Germans were going to attack at Kursk, and they were going to do it with everything they had. The Soviets had penetrated German command structures through a network of spies that included the famous Lucy spy ring operating out of Switzerland, which was feeding them information pulled from British codebreakers at Bletchley Park. Whatever the source, Zhukov knew. And knowing, he prepared. What followed was perhaps the most methodical act of military preparation in history. Over the spring and early summer of 1943, more than 300,000 civilians were mobilized alongside Red Army engineers to dig trenches. Not just a few trenches. They dug more than 3,000 miles of trenches, enough, laid end to end, to stretch from Moscow to London and back again. They placed more than 400,000 mines in the ground, a density so extreme that some areas had nearly 3,000 mines per mile. They installed layer after layer of anti-tank ditches, concrete pillboxes, gun emplacements, and interlocking fields of fire. They positioned artillery in depth, so that even if the Germans broke through the first line, the second and third lines were already ranged and zeroed. Zhukov's concept was brutal in its elegance. He would let the Germans come. He would absorb their assault, grind their armored spearheads down to nothing against the prepared defenses, exhaust their men and machines and fuel and ammunition. And then, when the Wehrmacht was spent and reeling, he would unleash the massive Soviet armored reserves, the steppe front, held carefully back from the initial fighting, and drive through the weakened German lines in a counter-offensive that would shatter the Eastern Front entirely. To execute this plan, he needed patience, discipline, and an almost inhuman willingness to absorb punishment. The Soviet soldiers who would hold the defensive lines knew they were there to be hammered. They knew the German assault would be devastating. They went to their positions anyway, and they dug, and they waited. The German steel beast. What the Germans were sending at those defenses was, in terms of raw technology, the most powerful armored force ever assembled. Operation Citadel would be spearheaded by Germany's newest and most fearsome tanks, the Tiger I, the Panther, and the massive Ferdinand tank destroyer. The Tiger I was already famous, or infamous, depending on which side of the gun you were on. Weighing nearly 57 tons, armed with the lethal 88mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank at ranges exceeding a mile, it was essentially invulnerable to most Soviet anti-tank weapons from the front. Soviet tank crews had learned, at tremendous cost, that facing a Tiger head-on was suicide. You needed to flank it, get behind it, find the thinner armor on its sides or rear, a maneuver that often meant driving directly into its field of fire. The Panther was newer and, in many ways, more dangerous. Designed specifically as a response to the Soviet T-34, a tank that had shocked German designers with its sloped armor and wide tracks, the Panther combined thick, well-angled armor with a powerful 75mm gun that could penetrate nearly anything the Soviets had. In theory, it was the perfect tank. In practice, it was delivered to the front with serious mechanical problems, the result of being rushed into production before the engineering was fully resolved. Many Panthers would break down before they ever fired a shot. The Ferdinand, also called the Elephant, was even more extreme. It carried an 88mm gun of extraordinary power inside a heavily armored casemate, but it had a critical weakness: it had no machine gun. Designed purely as a tank destroyer, it was helpless against enemy infantry at close range, a vulnerability that Soviet soldiers would exploit with terrifying results. Commanding the southern German thrust was SS General Paul Hauser, leading three of the most elite divisions in the entire Wehrmacht: the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart Adolf Hitler, the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, and the 3rd SS Panzer Division Totenkopf. These were not ordinary units. They were the ideological shock troops of the Nazi state, ferociously trained, lavishly equipped, and utterly fanatical. Against them, the Soviets would need every kilometer of their minefields and every gun of their artillery. The night before, on the evening of July 4, 1943, something remarkable happened that revealed just how thoroughly Soviet intelligence had penetrated German planning. As German assault teams were moving into their final attack positions, Soviet artillery suddenly opened up across the entire Kursk front. Not a full bombardment, just harassing fire, carefully directed, striking roads and assembly areas and communication centers. It was unnerving. The Germans pressed forward, assuming it was coincidence, routine Soviet activity. But many German soldiers sensed something was wrong. The enemy knew. The enemy was ready. They were right. A German prisoner captured by Soviet scouts had revealed the time of the attack, 3 a.m. on July 5. Armed with this knowledge, Soviet Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky made a decision of breathtaking boldness. At 2:20 a.m., 40 minutes before the German attack was scheduled to begin, he ordered a massive Soviet artillery barrage of his own. For nearly an hour, more than 3,000 Soviet guns fired at the German assembly areas, where troops and tanks were bunched together in the darkness waiting for the signal to advance. The carnage was significant. More importantly, the psychological effect was devastating. German soldiers who had been keying themselves up for the attack of their lives suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of a hurricane of steel. When the German barrage finally opened at 4:30 a.m., delayed by the need to reorganize, the men who moved forward were already shaken. Already rattled. Already wondering what else the enemy knew. As the German tanks rumbled forward in the gray pre-dawn light, they ran almost immediately into the first of the Soviet minefields. The drivers felt the ground tremble differently, not the ordinary shudder of tank tracks on soft earth, but the sharp, jarring blast of anti-tank mines detonating against the road wheels. Some tanks stopped dead, their tracks blown off, blocking the paths behind them. Combat engineers rushed forward under fire to clear lanes, dying in dozens as Soviet anti-tank guns opened up. The battle had barely begun, and already it was unlike anything the veterans had seen. Hell in the north. The northern attack, led by General Walter Model's Ninth Army, ran into trouble almost from the first hour. Model had more than 300 tanks and assault guns, but he faced the most densely mined terrain on the entire front. His infantry, who needed to advance first to clear paths for the armor, were cut down in the minefields and by withering Soviet artillery. The Ferdinand tank destroyers, those massive steel monsters with their devastating guns, proved almost useless in close terrain. Whenever they got near Soviet infantry positions, soldiers armed with anti-tank grenades and Molotov cocktails swarmed them and destroyed them with shocking ease. In the first 2 days of fighting, the Ninth Army managed to advance barely 6 miles. Against a defensive depth of nearly 100 miles, it was nothing. The men fighting in the northern salient experienced combat of an intensity that tested the boundaries of human endurance. Soviet artillery fired continuously, the shells coming in at such a rate that the ground seemed to never stop shaking. Tank commanders who raised their heads above their hatches for a few seconds of observation were shot by snipers who had spent weeks perfecting their positions. Infantry who tried to advance across open ground were cut down by interlocking machine gun fire from positions that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, invisible until they opened up at point-blank range. And always, there were the mines. German engineers, working under fire, would clear a lane, mark it, move forward, and find that overnight, Soviet infiltrators had seeded new mines in the cleared area. The ground could not be trusted. The war at Kursk was being fought not just against soldiers but against the earth itself, which had been made into a weapon. By July 10, Model's northern attack had effectively stalled. His losses were grievous: hundreds of tanks destroyed or damaged, tens of thousands of men killed or wounded, and he had not come close to breaking through the Soviet defensive lines. In the north, Operation Citadel was already dying. But in the south, something extraordinary was about to happen. Prokhorovka. The southern attack, commanded by General Hermann Hoth with his 4th Panzer Army, had made better progress. The SS Panzer Corps had driven forward with tremendous violence, smashing through the 1st and 2nd Soviet defensive belts through sheer tactical skill and ferocity. By July 11, they had advanced nearly 40 miles, Not the full breakout they needed, but far more than Model had managed in the north. If they could punch through the final Soviet defensive line, they might yet achieve something from the operation. Facing them, Soviet General Pavel Rotmistrov had been given command of the 5th Guards Tank Army, one of the premier armored formations in the Red Army, held in reserve precisely for this moment. His tanks, T-34s and T-70s, were outnumbered in quality by the German armor. At standard combat ranges, the German 88mm guns could destroy a T-34 before it could close to effective fighting distance. Rotmistrov knew this, and he devised a solution that was simultaneously brilliant and terrifying in its implications for the men who would carry it out. He would charge directly at the Germans. At full speed, closing the distance as fast as his tanks could move, ignoring losses, getting so close to the German machines that their superior gun range would become irrelevant. In the chaos of close-quarter tank fighting, where vehicles were mixing together at ranges of 50 meters or less, where a tank might be simultaneously firing at an enemy in front while another enemy rammed it from behind, the Germans' technical advantages would be neutralized. It was a doctrine of violent, bloody desperation. It was also, given the circumstances, exactly right. The morning of July 12, 1943, dawned under a hot summer sun. On both sides, men who had barely slept were mounting their tanks, checking their ammunition, saying whatever they said to God or to each other or to no one at all. The Soviet assault force numbered roughly 600 tanks. The German force in their path numbered around 300, but they were better tanks, with better guns, commanded by men of extraordinary experience. At approximately 8:30 a.m., both forces began moving toward each other. What happened next is one of the most debated engagements in military history. The Soviet tanks came charging forward in waves, their engines screaming, their guns firing even as they raced across the steppe. The Germans, startled by the speed and mass of the Soviet assault, found their careful defensive formations disrupted almost immediately. Within minutes, the two forces had interpenetrated, Soviet and German tanks swirling together in a confused, horrific melee that stretched across the rolling terrain around the small town of Prokhorovka. The noise was beyond description. Hundreds of tank engines, hundreds of tank guns firing at point-blank range, the screech of metal on metal as tanks sideswiped each other, the explosion of ammunition going up, the screams of men trapped in burning vehicles, the hammering of machine guns. It was not war as even the most experienced veterans had understood it. It was something new and terrible. Soviet crews dying in one tank would bail out, find the nearest German tank, and climb onto it, trying to stuff grenades into the hatches. German crews disabled by mines or mechanical failure would climb out under fire to engage Soviet infantry hand to hand. The crew of one Soviet tank, their vehicle immobilized and burning, used their machine gun until the ammunition ran out, then drove the flaming tank directly into a German panzer, taking the German crew with them. By the time darkness fell on July 12, nearly 700 vehicles had been destroyed in and around Prokhorovka. The German advance had been stopped. Completely, utterly, finally stopped. The weight of numbers. To understand what the combatants endured at Kursk, you have to try, however inadequately, to grasp the scale of the violence. In the first day of fighting alone, more artillery shells were fired on the Kursk front than in entire campaigns of the First World War. The sky was rarely visible from the ground, obscured by smoke, dust, and the contrails of thousands of aircraft fighting their own desperate battle overhead. Soviet and German air forces committed approximately 4,000 aircraft to the battle, fighters, ground attack planes, level bombers, and the air battles were as savage and confused as the fighting on the ground. The men who fought here came from every corner of two enormous empires at war. German soldiers from Bavaria and Prussia and the Rhineland, many of them veterans of 3 years of brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. Soviet soldiers from Kazakhstan and Ukraine and Siberia and the Caucasus, many of them teenagers who had been rushed through abbreviated training programs. Volunteers and conscripts and survivors and replacements, fighting in languages the men next to them might not fully understand, united only by the necessity of the moment. The wounded had nowhere safe to go. Medical stations set up behind the lines were hit by artillery. Roads clogged with burning vehicles made it nearly impossible to evacuate casualties. Soviet soldiers who survived the initial German assault often lay in the open for hours or days before they could be reached. German soldiers trapped in disabled tanks in no man's land burned to death while their comrades, unable to reach them under fire, listened to them scream. The Battle of Kursk, from start to finish, killed or wounded somewhere between 300,000 and 500,000 men. Even at the conservative estimate, that is more than 30,000 casualties every single day. More than 1,200 every hour. More than 20 every minute. Every minute of every hour of every day, somewhere in the Kursk salient, a man was dying, while the battle ground on and the commanders moved their markers on their maps and calculated their next moves. The turning point nobody saw coming. On July 13, 2 days after the massive armored collision at Prokhorovka, Adolf Hitler summoned his senior commanders and told them something that shocked them profoundly: Operation Citadel was cancelled. The order to halt came not because the German armies had been definitively defeated, they hadn't been, quite, but because of events unfolding 1,000 miles away. On July 10, Allied forces had landed on Sicily. The Italian government was tottering. Hitler needed forces to shore up the Italian front, and he could not afford to keep feeding men and machines into the Kursk meat grinder. The German generals were furious. Manstein in particular believed the battle was still winnable. But Hitler was dealing with a widening war on multiple fronts, and his resources, already strained by 3 years of total war, could not stretch to cover everything. The decision to halt Citadel was, in retrospect, irrelevant to the battle's ultimate outcome. The Germans had failed to achieve their objective. They had not broken through the Soviet defenses, had not encircled and destroyed the forces in the Kursk salient, had not delivered the decisive blow that Hitler had promised would restore German strategic initiative in the East. The tremendous sacrifice, in men, tanks, irreplaceable trained crews and junior officers, had bought nothing of strategic value. But the end of German offensive operations was not the end of the battle. It was only the beginning of the second act. The storm breaks. While the Germans had been spending themselves against the Soviet defenses, Zhukov had been carefully, methodically preparing the counteroffensive he had planned from the start. Operation Kutuzov struck the German forces north of the Kursk salient on July 12, the same day as Prokhorovka, and it hit like a thunderbolt. Fresh Soviet armies that the Germans had not known existed poured through gaps in the exhausted German lines, driving toward the city of Orel. Operation Rumyantsev, the southern counteroffensive, was launched on August 3 and was even more devastating. 3 Soviet tank armies, nearly 2,000 tanks and armored vehicles, smashed into the German positions south of Kursk with a violence that had not been seen even in the battles of the previous week. The Germans tried to establish new defensive lines, but the Soviet momentum was simply too great. The cities of Orel and Belgorod fell in rapid succession. Kharkiv, the 4th largest city in the Soviet Union, a city that had changed hands multiple times and been fought over with incredible ferocity, fell to Soviet forces on August 23, 1943. As it fell, Stalin ordered a salute of 224 guns fired in Moscow. It was the first such salute of the war. There would be many more to come, as the Red Army began the great march westward that would not stop until it reached Berlin. What was lost and what was won? The Battle of Kursk is often described as the turning point of the Eastern Front, and this is true, but the truth is more nuanced than simple phrases suggest. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht never again launched a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. Never. For the remaining 22 months of the war in Europe, the German army fought entirely on the defensive in the east, giving ground steadily, unable to stop the inevitable Soviet advance westward. For Germany, the losses at Kursk were replaceable in terms of raw numbers. More men could be conscripted, more tanks could roll off the production lines. What could not be replaced so easily was the trained, experienced core of the armored forces, the tank commanders with thousands of hours of combat experience, the crew members who had developed instincts and skills that only years of fighting could forge, the junior officers who knew how to exploit a situation in the fluid chaos of armored battle. These men died at Kursk in numbers that permanently degraded German tactical effectiveness. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Kursk came at a price that is almost impossible to fully comprehend. Soviet losses exceeded German losses by a significant margin. Some estimates put Soviet dead and wounded at 3 or even 4 times the German numbers. The Red Army won at Kursk the way it won at so many places on the Eastern Front, by being willing to spend more men than the enemy could match. The Soviet people had already endured 2 years of catastrophic losses, millions dead, millions more in German captivity, entire regions of their country occupied and despoiled by an enemy that had made no secret of its intention to treat Slavic peoples as subhuman. What kept the Red Army fighting was partly fear of Stalin's savage disciplinary system, but it was also something else, something harder to quantify. A desperate, burning determination to defend their homeland that German planners had consistently underestimated, and would never stop underestimating, until Berlin itself was burning. The men behind the numbers. It is tempting, when dealing with battles of this scale, to deal only in formations and strategies and tank counts. It is important to resist that temptation. Behind every number in the Kursk casualty lists was a person. There was Sergeant Pavel Korotayev, a Soviet tank commander from Saratov, who survived Prokhorovka by climbing out of his burning T-34 and continuing to fight with a pistol until a German crew surrendered their own vehicle to him under circumstances that passed the bounds of ordinary belief. There was SS Sturmbannführer Joseph Diefenthal, commanding a Panzergrenadier battalion in the Das Reich Division, who led his men through 6 days of continuous fighting with almost no sleep, somehow keeping them effective when units on either side of him collapsed. There was Natalia Shpak, a Soviet nurse working at a field hospital 5 miles behind the front lines, who performed triage under artillery fire for 18 consecutive hours, and who later said that what she remembered most was not the wounds, but the silence of the men who were too far gone to scream. There was the anonymous German tank driver who, after his Tiger was immobilized by a mine and his crew killed one by one, sat alone in the turret for 11 hours, firing at anything that moved, refusing to surrender, and who was finally killed when a Soviet anti-tank gun put a round through the side armor at close range. There was the Soviet anti-tank gun crew, 4 men, who held their position in a forward trench as the German tanks rolled over them, surviving the first wave by lying flat and then emerging to engage tanks from behind, killing 3 before they were killed themselves. Their names are not known. History remembers the names of the generals and the numbers of the divisions. The men who actually bled in the fields around Kursk are mostly remembered only by their families, and sometimes not even by them, since the chaos of the fighting meant that many bodies were never recovered, and many men simply disappeared into the vast accounting of the missing. Why it still matters. The Battle of Kursk matters, nearly 80 years later, for reasons beyond the purely historical. It is a story about preparation meeting opportunity, about how the Soviets, who had been catastrophically unprepared for the German invasion of June 1941, had spent 2 years learning from their defeats to the point where they could anticipate and defeat the most powerful offensive Germany could mount. It is a story about the limits of technology, about how Germany's finest tanks, the Tigers and Panthers that were supposed to be invincible, were defeated by mines and infantry and overwhelming numbers when properly employed. It is a story about deception and intelligence, about how the Soviets' knowledge of German plans allowed them to transform a potentially catastrophic attack into a controlled defensive battle that wore the attackers down before the counteroffensive even began. And it is, ultimately, a story about what human beings are capable of enduring. The men who fought at Kursk, on both sides, experienced conditions that would be difficult to believe if they were not so thoroughly documented. They kept fighting. They kept advancing under fire. They kept their positions when every instinct demanded they run. Some did this for ideology. Some did it for their comrades. Some did it out of simple terror of the consequences of not doing it. Most, probably, did it for some complicated mixture of all these things that no historian's analysis can fully capture. The Kursk salient is quiet now. Wheat grows where the tanks burned. Villages rebuilt from rubble look like ordinary Russian villages. The memorials stand, and the tour buses stop at Prokhorovka where a museum marks the site of the greatest tank battle in history. Veterans, their numbers dwindling each year until now there are none left, used to come too, and sometimes they would stand and look out over the fields for a long time without saying anything. They were remembering something that numbers cannot capture. They were remembering what it felt like to be young and terrified and alive in a world that was doing its best to kill them. They were remembering the faces of men who did not come home. They were remembering, perhaps, the strange and terrible privilege of surviving something that others did not survive, and wondering, as survivors always wonder, whether they deserved it. The Battle of Kursk, July and August, 1943. 2 million men, 6,000 tanks, a landscape of extraordinary violence and extraordinary human endurance. And at the end of it, a verdict that the remaining years of the war would only confirm. The Third Reich, having committed everything it had in one final bid for decisive victory in the East, had failed. The long, bloody, inevitable road to Berlin had begun. The battle lasted from July 5 to August 23, 1943. It involved more than 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks, and 4,000 aircraft. It remains the largest armored engagement in the history of warfare. When it was over, the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front had shifted to the Soviet Union, and it never shifted back.